Part of that restoration included the return of gargoyles to this lantern. When it was originally built, there were drain spouts in the form of iron gargoyles. They were removed very early in this lighthouse's history, but they were returned in that 2004 restoration.
This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Bar Harbor Whale Watch is famous for, well, right, watching whales. But 4 times a summer, they're also famous for lighthouses. 3 of those trips haven't even happened yet, and you'll be hearing more about them during today's show. But one of those trips happened a couple of Saturdays ago. It was called the Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour, because for this day at sea, they took the Friendship 5, a big, fast catamaran, and ran it up the coast all the way to New Brunswick, hitting 18 lighthouses in one day, 6 of them in Canada. There are only 2 boats in Maine big enough and fast enough to do that, and Bar Harbor Whale Watch owns both of them. Never mind that Maine lighthouses are iconic landmarks that draw visitors from all over the world, they're also reminders of our rich maritime heritage, because each lighthouse has a story to tell, and today, we'll tell some of those stories. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Bar Harbor Whale Watch, Napa Auto Parts, and EBS.
We want to first welcome you again on board the Friendship 5 for our beautiful U.S. and Bay of Fundy Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour. We're expecting a beautiful day today. You guys picked a good one.
The morning is Saturday, July 29th. The vessel is the Friendship 5, a jet-powered catamaran that can hit 33 knots or better, giving it the speed and range to make this 170-mile round trip while stopping at every lighthouse along the way. We'll go up the coast from Bar Harbor, hugging the shore all the way past Campobello and over to mainland New Brunswick. Then we'll head out to some offshore islands, including Grand Manan and Machias Seal Island, before cruising back to Bar Harbor by way of 2 lighthouses in Frenchman's Bay. I should warn you now, this is too big a trip to fit into one episode. The second half of this journey is next weekend's radio show. The ringmaster of the circus is Zach Cliver, chief naturalist for Bar Harbor Whale Watch.
My background is in environmental science and education. I've been guiding trips here for 28 years. So I'll be narrating as well throughout the trip, jumping on and having a chance to talk about the wildlife. As we're going out of the bay here, you can look for porpoises. The harbor porpoise are 3 to 6 feet long, a little triangular shaped fin. They just quickly leap over the top of the water, and we can see them all throughout the trip today. I'm sure we'll see a lot of them.
We also have some world-class lighthouse experts in the boat. The 2 you will hear from most are Jeremy D'Entremont and Chris Miles. Jeremy is president of the American Lighthouse Foundation and has written books on the lighthouses of Maine, New England, the West Coast. He's written a book on the shipwrecks of Maine. You'll be hearing Jeremy for all of the American lighthouses on this trip. Chris Miles is from Nova Scotia and was a longtime lighthouse keeper for the Canadian Coast Guard at many Canadian lights, including some of those we're about to visit. He'll give us the story on those. He's a founding member of a preservation group in Nova Scotia and wrote the book on lighthouses there. He'll give us the scoop on all the Canadian lighthouses we'll visit today and on next week's show. This is a long trip, 170 miles, stopping for an average of 10 minutes at each of 18 lighthouses, plus any whales and unusual wildlife we might see along the way.
The most important announcement of the day, remember we're going to be on this boat for about 8 to 9 hours. We have 3 bathrooms only, and they are located on the first level all the way towards the back of the boat.
Okay, that's covered. Food is covered.
If you're down below, you may have noticed that we put out a lot of fruit. There's baskets of apples, oranges, bananas. Help yourself, anything you want to drink at the galley. If you want coffee, tea, water, soda, anything like that. If you want, later in the trip, if you want beer or mixed drinks, those you can purchase. But if you want something else, let us know. You can go to the galley and get that. And we are going to be serving up some clam chowder eventually. So we'll let you know when that's happening, and then we'll come around with lunch. We're going to bring lunch to you wherever you are, okay?
We're just now rounding Schoodic Point, and we can see one of our lighthouses in the distance. This is a good time to remember how big lighthouse visits have become as tourist destinations. And Maine has 65 lighthouses. Again, Zach Cliver.
You can see Petit Manan Island Lighthouse out there at 1 o'clock. We'll be stopping there soon, but we're going to start by going into Prospect Harbor, which is just up around the corner here, and that'll be our first stop.
We're coming up on our first lighthouse. You're going to hear a few terms that need a little explanation. Foremost, you need to know what a Fresnel lens is. For centuries, the biggest problem with lighthouses was that you needed to make them visible from as far away as possible. A single flame was visible for only so far. You could put a lens in front of it and magnify a beam, but it would have to be a very big and very heavy lens. French physicist Augustin-Jean Fresnel perfected a way to grind lenses with a bunch of concentric circles, each circle magnifying the beam. That greatly reduced the volume and weight of the lens. Some of our modern-day theater spotlights still use that design. The first Fresnel lens in a lighthouse was set up in France in 1823. They come in 6 sizes called orders, with a first order Fresnel lens being the biggest and a 6th order the smallest. Maine had a few big lenses over the years, but most were on the smaller side. We're now at the Prospect Harbor Light. This is on the mainland, so there's a good chance you've seen this one if you've been along this part of the coast, although it's on a Navy base and you can't walk right up to it. The first lighthouse there was built in 1850, but the current one dates back to 1891. It's unusual because there aren't that many conical wooden lighthouses in Maine. Most of them sort of rotted and fell down. Jeremy D'Entremont explains.
The lighthouse is 38 feet tall. The light is 42 feet above the water. At one time it had a 5th order Fresnel lens, but it has a modern 250 millimeter optic these days, and I believe it's on 24 hours. I think I just saw it flash, didn't I? Yeah. It's actually flashing red every 6 seconds with 2 white sectors, so we're seeing the light through a white sector at this point. The village here of Prospect Harbor developed a substantial fishing fleet in the late 1800s. As a result, a granite lighthouse was established here in 1850. But just a few years later, between 1859 and 1870, the light was deactivated because they felt there wasn't enough shipping traffic. But apparently the traffic increased because the light was reactivated in 1870 for the fishing traffic and also to serve as a harbor of refuge for coasting vessels. The original granite lighthouse was attached to a keeper's house, but the original lighthouse was replaced in 1891 by this wooden tower that you see here today, and a new 1.5-story farmhouse-style keeper's house, which you see right behind the lighthouse there. A Civil War veteran by the name of Ambrose Wasgatt, W-A-S-G-A-T-T, Ambrose Wasgatt became keeper in 1891. Wasgatt's 2 daughters later remembered having a lot of visitors at the light station. They would play croquet with guests at the light station. They would have annual open houses at the lighthouse that included boathouse dinners. They would set up long tables inside the boathouse with large quantities of food. I have a feeling a lobster was a big part of that. Keeper Wasgatt also had a granddaughter named Winifred, who was born in the keeper's house here in 1917, and she grew up to become a very prominent Baptist minister in the area. So the light was automated in 1934 with the use of acetylene gas, but they kept a caretaker by the name of John Workman living here until 1953. The Fresnel lens was removed in 1951, but again, it still remains an activate to navigation with a modern optic in there. The surrounding grounds are a naval facility. It's actually a naval communications facility, and it is off limits to the public, although you can drive right up near the gate and get a good view from the gate, but I think it looks probably its best from the water here. This lighthouse is one of the ones that has some ghost stories attached to it. It seems like if you dig deep enough, you'll find ghost stories at probably most of these lighthouses. And the story here that you usually hear is that there's a little sea captain statue on a windowsill by the stairs inside the house, and that if you point him in one direction, he will change his position even though nobody's around. He seems to shift and change the way he's facing all on his own, this little sea captain statue. I will tell you that I have an open mind on the paranormal. I actually often do a lecture on lighthouse ghost stories, but I can't really say that I necessarily put a lot of stock into the little sea captain statue story here. I did get to take part in a documentary made in 2002 by the Travel Channel, Haunted Lighthouses of America, and part of it was shot here. And if you ever see that show, there's a scene shot here at this lighthouse
where you see the mysterious shadow of the keeper moving up the stairs inside the lighthouse. And that's actually my shadow. They had me put on the uniform, and I got to play the lighthouse ghost in that one scene. So that was fun. So our next lighthouse is going to be Petite Manan, which you've already seen off in the distance. And we'll probably be there in a jiffy before you know it.
As a matter of fact, I know exactly where we're going to get to the next lighthouse. We'll take a break and be there in 3 minutes. We're on board the Bar Harbor Whale Watch boat Friendship 5, and this is their annual Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour. An entire day in the water, hitting every lighthouse between Bar Harbor and Canada. 18 lighthouses altogether, including 6 in New Brunswick. It's a 2-part episode, with the second half of that trip taking place on next weekend's episode of Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, here on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. We're doing the Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour with Bar Harbor Whale Watch. This was an all-day trip on Saturday, July 29th. We went up the coast from Bar Harbor all the way to New Brunswick and hit 18 lighthouses. Another trip is coming up next weekend. On Saturday, the Friendship 5 will leave the dock in Bar Harbor and go down the coast all the way to Matinicus Rock, hitting 16 lighthouses. If you're interested, you can find the info at barharborwhales.com. barharborwhales.com. On this 2-part episode of Wild Maine, we're hitting 18 lighthouses, and we're now only up to our second.
Okay, we're slowing down here as we get near Petite Manan Island. Very interesting place for a number of reasons, including the lighthouse. It is now considered part of the Maine Coastal Islands National Wildlife Refuge. There's been a lighthouse here since 1817. This lighthouse that you see here today was built in 1855. It is 119 feet tall. It's the second tallest lighthouse in Maine, second to Boone Island Light, which is about 133 feet tall. This is still an active light. It's got a modern so-called VRB-25 rotating plastic optic. It's solar powered. And it's got a fog signal, as you just heard, with one blast every 30 seconds, and it's on 24 hours. And still an active light. Again, it flashes white every 10 seconds. This island was named Petite Manan by explorer Samuel de Champlain. When he was exploring in the area, he also named nearby Petite Manan Point because they reminded him of Grand Manan to the northeast. Manan apparently comes from a Micmac Indian word meaning island out to sea. President James Monroe and Congress authorized a lighthouse here in 1817 to serve shipping traffic heading toward several bays and harbors around here, and also to warn of a dangerous bar between this island and Petite Manan Point. When this lighthouse was rebuilt, again, this 119-foot granite tower was built in the mid-1850s, and it was fitted with the second-order Fresnel lens, a huge Fresnel lens. And the beautiful old second-order Fresnel lens from here is now on display at the Maine Lighthouse Museum in Rockland. If you have not been there, you need to go there. It's the country's largest collection of lighthouse lenses and other paraphernalia. And the second-order, I believe it's about 9 feet tall lens from this lighthouse is one of the centerpieces of the Maine Lighthouse Museum in Rockland. This lighthouse had problems in storms in its early days. An 1856 storm weakened the tower and actually knocked some of the stone blocks out. It was repaired, and then another storm in 1869 made the whole tower sway so much that the weights that hung inside the tower that were what ran the rotation of the lens, those weights fell during the storm and broke some of the stairs. And those stairs were not repaired for many, many years. Petite Manan here is considered one of the foggiest places on the Maine coast, an average of about 70 foggy days a year, about 20% of the time. They added a fog bell here with striking mechanism in 1855, and then a steam fog whistle in 1869. And as you hear, there's still an electric modern fog signal here today. In 1916, December 29th, 1916, a keeper named Eugene Ingalls left Petite Manan Island in a powerboat to meet with his wife, who was the daughter of the keeper at Moose Peak Light, which we're going to see a little later. Her father, Herbert Robertson, was the keeper there. Eugene Ingalls, the keeper here, on his way to Moose Peak Light, ran into heavy seas, and he was never found. His boat was found overturned, but he was never found. So not that unusual a happening. You know, you dig into the history of these remote, rugged offshore lighthouses, it's pretty likely you're going to find a tragedy in there somewhere. I always tell people lighthouse keeping wasn't as romantic as you think. It was dangerous, hard work, didn't pay real well, and again, not unusual to have a tragedy associated with a lighthouse like this. There was a woman named Maisie Freeman Anderson who grew up here, where her father, James Freeman, was the keeper in the 1930s, and she later wrote an article in for Down East magazine about her childhood here, and I'm going to read you a little bit about what she wrote. She said, "No trees grew in the shallow soil of Petite Manane, but there were patches of grass, and a few hardy wildflowers grew in abundance, even among the rocks, sweet pea, buttercups, and others. We had a small cranberry bog yielding berries to can each year. We tried putting in a vegetable garden using seaweed for fertilizer, but we gave it up as hopeless. We also tried keeping a cow because fresh milk was a rarity. I shall never forget getting her there. You've never lived until you've shared a rowboat with a cow." She remembered one high tide when the entire island was under a foot of water. The chicken coops were floating in the cranberry bog, and the family had to move everything to the second floor of the keeper's house. This light was electrified in 1938 and was automated in 1972. The last Coast Guard keepers left here in 1972 and went through a succession of modern optics, and again it now has a rotating VRB 25 acrylic optic.
Quick note, the VRB-25 is a modern beacon built by a company in New Zealand. It's designed to be very low maintenance, meeting U.S. Coast Guard specs. It's a 12-volt system with a bulb that burns constantly, since an incandescent bulb burns out quickly if you're flashing it on and off all the time. The flashing is accomplished by having a series of Fresnel lenses rotating around the bulb. About a quarter of Maine's currently active lighthouses actually use this system, since we're pretty much no longer burning whale oil. We'll now skip over to Pond Island Light in Millbridge. This is one of those lights you can't really see from the mainland, so getting on a boat like this one is about the only way you're going to get to know it.
All right, so here we are at the Narraguagus or Pond Island Light. This island is Pond Island. This light was established in 1853, and it's pretty much the original lighthouse standing here, but it's gone through a lot of changes, which I'll explain to you in a minute. The lighthouse is 31 feet tall. It is no longer an active lighthouse, and it is privately owned. In the 19th century, the little town of Millbridge nearby here was an important shipping point for lumber coming out of the Narraguagus River, and there was also a lot of fishing and shipbuilding in the area, and as a result, Congress appropriated $4,000 for a lighthouse here in 1851. And they chose the east side of 360-acre Pond Island right here. There is a small freshwater pond here that gave the island its name, although I hear it's mostly a swamp these days. The government purchased land for the lighthouse and built it in 1853. It went into service in April of 1853. Consisted of a tower and lantern on top of a keeper's dwelling originally. A fifth order Fresnel lens replaced the original multiple lamps and reflectors in 1856. In 1875, it was reported that the dwelling was uninhabitable here, so they built a new 5-room house in 1876, and much of the original house was removed from around the tower. In 1894, the lighthouse was reinforced with a layer of brick, so it's a pretty unusual case. It's gone through a lot of changes over the years. Again, a granite tower with a layer of brick that was added later. Most of the keepers here kind of came and went pretty fast, but there was one keeper here named William Gott, G-O-T-T. He was here for more than 20 years, starting in 1893. An island resident named Elizabeth Hitchcock later recalled when she was a girl she would visit with the Gott family, the keeper and his family. She said, quote, "I would go see the keeper's tall, slender, red-haired wife. She seemed always to be baking biscuits or yeast bread, and the kitchen smelled of bread, kerosene, and fresh paint," unquote. In 1929, a Nova Scotia schooner en route to Massachusetts was wrecked on Petite Manane Bar, And the two keepers at Petite Manan tried to rescue the crew, but they found that the vessel had been abandoned. The captain and 3 crewmen escaped in a rowboat and took refuge here at Narraguegas Light Station. The keeper, Charles Tracy, cared for them for 12 days. And then on August 16th, 1929, they left in their rowboat to row 95 miles back to Nova Scotia with food provided by the keeper here. The British Consul General at Boston wrote a letter expressing his thanks for the services of Keeper Tracy here at this lighthouse and the two keepers at Petite Manan Light. This light was discontinued in 1934. The property was sold at auction to a man named Wilbur Dameron, and I believe it's still in that family. This lighthouse also has a lot of ghost stories. There's a book about the history of Pond Island that tells some ghost stories here. Supposedly some members of the Dameron family were sleeping in a downstairs bedroom, and they heard a woman speaking loudly and angrily in a foreign language. And the only woman present at the time spoke only English, and she claimed that she was sleeping all night, so they didn't know what they heard. And one of them was awakened in the middle of the night by a loud noise next to him, like something fell on the bed. And they were kind of disturbed by all that, but haven't heard any recent ghost stories coming out of here.
Every lighthouse in Maine has a story, and the guy who knows these stories is Jeremy D'Entremont, who will next tell us the tale of Nash Island. We'll be there in about 3 minutes. We're on board Bar Harbor Whale Watch. This was the Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour on Saturday, July 29th. They've got 3 more lighthouse tours coming up this summer. Info at barharborwhales.com. You're listening to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8 on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Today is the first of a 2-part show. It's the first half of a Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour up the Maine coast to Canada, offered up by Bar Harbor Whale Watch on July 29th. We hit 18 lighthouses in just one day. Another trip from Bar Harbor to Matinicus Rock, visiting 16 lighthouses, is going to happen next Saturday. Details at barharborwhales.com. We're now up to a lighthouse you probably didn't even know existed. Jeremy D'Entremont tells the tales.
All right, we're slowing down here as we get close to Nash Island Lighthouse, right in front of us here. You can see all the other buildings are gone at this light station. This is not an active light anymore. It has not been active since 1981. There's been a lighthouse here on this island since 1838. In the 1830s, there were vessels being built and launched around this area in the various towns near here, Columbia Falls, Addison, on the Pleasant River. And it was a very busy area. Besides the shipbuilding, there was coastal trade and lumber and granite and fish being exported from here. So in 1837, Congress authorized the building of a lighthouse here on this island. They chose Nash Island, which is actually the smaller of 2 islands that are sometimes referred to as Big Nash and Little Nash, or Little Nash's Island. This is Little Nash or Little Nash's, but usually just referred to as Nash Island. The government purchased 4 acres of land on the island from the Nash family for $409. And they built the original lighthouse here in the following year. It was a small 24-foot conical rubble stone tower. It was rebuilt in 1874. That's when this lighthouse was built. This one is 51 feet tall. It's made of brick. They had a bell tower here with a fog bell and striking mechanism for some years. That was added in 1888. Before they had a fog bell here, it was reported that for a while they had a Chinese-type gong that the keeper would have to sound in times of fog. A man named Osmond Cummings, a native of Jonesport nearby, was keeper here from 1902 to 1910. In 1904, Keeper Cummings called authorities to say... We have eagles? Where are the eagles? Right to the left. Okay, we have 2 eagles I'm hearing mixed in. Oh, there's one flying to the right, yeah. Mixed in with the gulls flying around the lighthouse there. We have a couple of bald eagles. But anyway, Keeper Osmond Cummings here in 1904 called the authorities to tell them that a fleet of torpedo boats was making its way through the bay here. A while later, the fog lifted, and he called again to say that it was actually a pod of humpback whales he had seen. but word got around that these whales were in the vicinity, and a frenzy of whale hunting ensued, and a couple of the whales were killed by the local fishermen. A man named Alan Carter Holt was the next keeper. He was here until 1916. Once rescued the crew of a fishing schooner and got an official commendation from Washington. John Purington, a native of Portland, Maine, became keeper here in 1916. He came with his wife, Ellen, and 7 children, including a 3-week-old infant, and they had 2 more sons born here at the light station. So they had 9 children living here. For a while, there were actually enough kids living here for a small school to be put in operation on the island with a teacher provided by the state. But when they reached high school age, the kids boarded and attended school in Jonesport. One of Keeper Purington's daughters was named Genevieve. She was better known as Jenny. I had the pleasure of meeting Jenny when she was well in her 80s. She was only about not quite 4 years old when the family arrived here at Nash Island. She started raising sheep on this island when she was a young girl. She continued to keep sheep on this island and I think a couple of other islands for the rest of her life. She was interviewed around 1980 for a book called "We Didn't Have Much, But We Sure Had Plenty." She said, quote, "Ever since I was 10 years old, I've been messing around in a boat. I had 10 lobster traps when I was 10 years old. Of course, we had to go to school, too. We started out having a teacher out there on the island, and we'd get in, maybe possibly 4 weeks out of the year. Teacher would go from island to island, 2 weeks here, 2 weeks there. By the time she got back to our island, we'd already forgot what she'd learned us. Then we'd go home and one of my brothers would propose. That's what kept happening to him. My 7 brothers took to marrying him as fast as they'd come on the island." That was pretty common. The state would send these traveling teachers and they'd marry sons of lighthouse keepers or assistant lighthouse keepers.
And really, it was Jenny's sheep that everyone remembers. Supposedly some sheep are still out there on Nash Island. We'll skip ahead to another rather obscure lighthouse.
Okay, we are approaching Moose Peak Light right in front of us here. This is still an active lighthouse. There's been a lighthouse here on this island since 1826. This tower you see here today was built in 1851, automated in 1972, and it is privately owned. I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes. The tower is 57 feet tall. The light is 72 feet above the water. It has a solar-powered modern VRB25 optic these days with a white flash every 30 seconds and a fog signal with 2 blasts every 30 seconds.
Oh, I should mention, this lighthouse and many others in Maine now have Mariner-activated foghorns. That is, they only sound off when somebody at sea needs to hear them. They can be turned on via the boat's VHF radio.
Anyway, this body of water between these islands here on the mainland is known as Moosabec Reach. Moosabec is believed to have had its origins as an Abenaki Indian word, possibly meaning moosehead. Nobody's quite sure why the name was used here, but there are a lot of variations on the name: Mispeki Reach, Moosabec Reach, and a few others, Moose Peak Reach. So this island, the island is called Mistake Island. Congress and President John Quincy Adams authorized the first lighthouse here in 1825. And it was established in the following year, October 1826. They built a short 24-foot rubble-stone tower at that time and a keeper's house with a wooden footbridge over a chasm between them. The first keeper was Alexander Milliken, and because of the isolation here, he begged for a pay raise and got a pay raise because this was a pretty difficult station. Again, the present tower you see here, this 57-foot brick tower, was built in 1851. There was a keeper named Charles Dobbins here from 1887 to 1905. He and his son rendered assistance to the crew of a Nova Scotia schooner in 1898, and the keeper Dobbins was awarded a gold watch by the Canadian government as a reward for helping that schooner. He could not accept the gift from the Canadian government until he was authorized to do so by an act of Congress. For most of its history, the station had a single keeper and an assistant who lived here on the island with their families. Usually, life was harmonious. The families of the head keeper and the assistant keeper mostly got along, but one time in 1887, it was reported, the local inspector reported to the Lighthouse Board that the, quote, wife of the principal keeper and his grown-up daughters used the vilest possible language toward the assistant keeper and his family, visitors, and even the principal keeper himself. So the principal keeper was soon removed and the assistant was promoted.
Hey, nowadays, if you want to say something vile and obnoxious, you can just tweet it. These were hard times back then. We're on board the Friendship 5. Bar Harbor Whale Watch conducted its annual Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour on July 29th, and we visited 18 lighthouses from here to Canada, including some that I didn't even know existed. One of those is up next, but the two after that are rather famous. Jeremy D'Entremont is the expert telling the stories. He's president of the American Lighthouse Foundation, and he wrote the book on Maine lighthouses. Stand by. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket, with Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. We're on a Bar Harbor Whale Watch boat somewhere just outside of Jonesport. It's their annual Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour, which took place on Saturday, July 29th, and I've crashed this party, grabbing a chance to learn about lighthouses that I didn't even know existed. Like this one.
Okay, we're closing in on Libby Island Light right in front of us here. And you've got a fog signal building right next to the lighthouse, and you hear the fog signal going. This one is on 24 hours a day. This is still an active aid to navigation. Obviously, the light is also still active with 2 white flashes every 20 seconds. And this one is another part of the Maine Coastal Islands National Wildlife Refuge. A wooden lighthouse may have been built here as early as 1817, but a new tower was built right here by the federal government in 1822, along with a wood frame keeper's house. The 1822 tower fell down just a few months after it was built. Not that unusual. A lot of our early lighthouse construction in this country in the early 1800s was quite shoddy. We were lagging behind places like England and France and lighthouse building for a long time until we got a new efficient lighthouse board, a national lighthouse board in 1852. But anyway, the 1822 tower here, stone tower, fell down, was rebuilt a short time later, and this is the tower that was built that replaced the one that fell down. The original lamps were replaced by a 4th order Fresnel lens, kind of a medium-size lens in 1855. This is another one of the foggiest places on the Maine coast. They had a fog bell with striking machinery for some years, and that was replaced by a fog trumpet in a building erected in 1884. And because of the added duties of having a fog signal here, this station had a keeper and an assistant keeper, and 2 houses here as well. The fog signal was sounded here in the year 1918. The fog signal was sounded for a total of 1,906 hours, the most of any station on the Maine coast. In spite of the light and the fog signals, there were a number of shipping accidents around here over the years. In December 1878, a schooner called the Caledonia ran into the ledges here at Libby Island. The captain, a deckhand, and the steward were killed. 2 passengers were rescued by a volunteer life-saving crew.
It's hard to imagine it just by looking at this island, but it was big enough that about 20 people lived here at one time, and they even had a baseball diamond out here, although you've got to think it was a little rocky. So kids invented other games. One of those kids was the lighthouse keeper's son, Fillmore Wass.
One of Fillmore Wass's favorite games as a kid was called Grass is Poison. In this game, the children had to walk around the perimeter of the island without touching any grass. This necessitated a climb down a 50-foot cliff near the lighthouse here. Of course, the parents never knew that the kids were playing that game, or I don't think it would have been allowed.
Just up the coast at the mouth of Cutler Harbor, there's a somewhat famous lighthouse, because this one was actually acquired by the American Lighthouse Foundation with the help of a local group called the Friends of Little River Lighthouse. When Congress made it easier for historic lighthouses to be acquired and preserved, this was the first lighthouse in New England to be saved under that act. It's now been beautifully restored. In fact, you can rent it and stay overnight.
All right, we now have Little River Lighthouse right in front of us. The keeper's house next to the lighthouse. Here at the entrance to Little River, which is actually the harbor of Cutler, the town of Cutler here. This lighthouse is still in active aid to navigation and is owned by the American Lighthouse Foundation. We'll tell you more about that in a few minutes. And there's a local chapter of the American Lighthouse Foundation, the Friends of Little River Lighthouse. The light station here was established in 1847, and this lighthouse was built in 1876, this cast iron tower that's here today. It was actually inactive for some years, from about 1975 to 2001. It was relighted in 2001. The tower's 41 feet tall. The light is 56 feet above mean high water here. At one time it had a 5th order Fresnel lens, now has a modern rotating VRB 25 acrylic optic, flashing white light every 6 seconds, and it has a fog signal with 1 blast every 10 seconds, Mariner activated. It was. As trade and shipbuilding and fishing were growing here in this area, the lighthouse was established in 1847, again on this 15-acre island at the entrance to the harbor. The original lighthouse was made of stone. It had a keeper's house attached to it. And as I mentioned, it got a 5th order Fresnel lens, a fairly small lens, in 1855. The lighthouse was rebuilt in 1876. Again, this 41-foot cast iron tower was built at that time. And the pretty keeper's house you see there, this wood frame keeper's house, was built in 1888. And the original stone dwelling was removed. One of the most prominent families that ever lived at this light station was the Corbetts. A man named Willie Corbett became keeper in 1921 and remained keeper until 1939 for 18 years. He and his wife had 8 children. They kept a cow, pigs, and chickens on the light station here, very common for family light stations. And it was reported that their cow once became very ill after drinking 3 gallons of kerosene, but I guess the cow survived that. Willie Corbett, the keeper, was an excellent fiddler. He sometimes left the island on Saturday nights to play at dances at a local life-saving station on Cross Island. His son Neil did a lot of work here. He helped wind the clockwork mechanisms that turned the light and sounded the fog bell. One July, during the Corbett stay here, there were 525 hours of fog during that 1 month. By the 1950s, there were Coast Guard keepers here. They would spend 21 days in the station, followed by 7 days off. And they would also bring men over from the West Quoddy lifeboat station to help out at the light station here at Little River. There was no electricity. The light still ran on kerosene at that time. And they still had to wind the mechanism that ran the fog bell as late as well into the 1950s, I believe.
This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Although Jeremy D'Entremont is doing most of the talking, he's president of the American Lighthouse Foundation, and he wrote the book on Maine lighthouses. We're on the Friendship 5, a Bar Harbor whale watch boat, and this is their Grand Slam tour of 18 lighthouses up the Maine coast and into Canada. In fact, we're nearly up to Canada. But first, we got to hit one of Maine's most famous lighthouses. I'm sure you've been to this one before, and you're about to be there again, but from a completely different viewpoint. Quoddy Head, next on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. There are 65 lighthouses spread out along 5,000 miles of Maine coastline. The one we're floating in front of right now is one of the most famous. We're at Quoddy Head in Lubec, home of Maine's iconic Candy Stripe Lighthouse. This is the Grand Slam Lighthouse Tour with Bar Harbor Whale Watch, a day-long trip on the ultra-fast catamaran Friendship 5, stopping at 18 lighthouses in the U.S. and Canada. Today's show is part 1 of a 2-part series. Next week, we'll start in Lubec and keep going till we've carved up a good part of the New Brunswick coast. By the way, next week, Bar Harbor Whale Watch is also doing its mid-coast lighthouse trip, steaming down the coast all the way to Matinicus Rock, stopping at 16 lighthouses along the way. Details at barharborwhales.com. On this trip and next, Jeremy D'Entremont is the interpreter. He's president of the Maine Lighthouse Foundation and wrote the book on Maine lighthouses.
All right, we're sneaking up on West Quoddy Head Light right in front of us here, at the easternmost point in the on the United States mainland. And you see Sail Rock directly ahead of us. I know Zach was talking about that a few minutes ago. Very distinctive, prominent rock right in front of us. Or not right in front of us, but a little bit in front of us. Anyway, this lighthouse is now part of West Quoddy Head State Park. It is actually owned by the state of Maine. It is maintained by the Maine Department of Parks and Land. There's also a nonprofit organization, the West Quoddy Head Lightkeepers Association, that maintains an interpretive center and gift shop in the Keeper's House. There's been a lighthouse here since 1808, and the present lighthouse was built in 1857. It's been automated since 1988. The tower is 49 feet tall. It's made of brick, and the light is 83 feet above mean high water. And this is one of the 8 lighthouses in the state of Maine that still has an active so-called classical Fresnel lens. I know a lot of you are lighthouse buffs on board and you know all about Fresnel lenses, but for those who might not know anything about them, just very briefly, Fresnel is capital F-R-E-S-N-E-L. It's a French name after Augustin Jean Fresnel, the inventor of the Fresnel lens. He was a French engineer, invented the lenses in France in 1822. He was a young man, really a genius, very important invention, and his beautiful lenses were eventually used in lighthouses all over the world. And basically they use multiple prisms to magnify and focus the light into a very powerful horizontal beam. Really one of the most important inventions of the 1800s. And this lighthouse still has a 3rd order Fresnel lens, which means it's the 3rd from the largest size that was made. Still a 3rd order Fresnel lens still in use here at West Quoddy Headlight. 2 white flashes every 15 seconds. You can see it's on 24 hours a day. It's flashing right now. And it has a fog signal, 2 blasts every 30 seconds. So anyway, as I mentioned, the lighthouse was established here in 1808. And the second keeper here was a man named Peter Godfrey. He was here from 1813 until he died at the age of 82 in 1839, 26 years later. His job was made very complicated by the War of 1812 because British troops claimed control of this light station during the War of 1812. And the British actually occupied the town of Eastport near here for a good part of the war. He was promised, Godfrey the keeper was promised that the British would pay him, but they never did. And he had a hard time, but eventually the occupation ended and he finally got his pay from the American government. At one time, the station had a fog cannon to warn mariners away from dangerous sail rocks here. This was one of several light stations in New England that had a fog cannon, Boston Light and Beaver Tail Light in Rhode Island being other ones. This station got one of the first fog bells in the United States in 1820. They tried different fog bells over the years, but during rough weather, they were often hard to hear offshore. So they eventually later got a fog horn here. The first lighthouse was badly constructed, had to be rebuilt in 1831, and then it was rebuilt again in 1857. As I mentioned, this 57-foot brick tower was built at that time. I haven't found exactly when the red and white stripes were added, but it appears to be soon after it was built in 1857. Red stripes on lighthouses in Canada are quite common. There's red on many Canadian lights, helps them stand out against snow for one thing. So this is one of very few lighthouses in the United States with red and white stripes. Assateague Light in Virginia being another one. Ephraim Johnson, who was a local man, arrived as the assistant keeper here in 1900, eventually became the head keeper and was here for quite a few years. A woman named Ruth Draper wrote an article about visiting here as a girl, and he was known as Captain Effie Johnson, the keeper here, and she said that he could predict the weather just by looking seaward and predict it with complete accuracy. He would look out and say something like land loom, weather breeder, rain tomorrow, and he was always right. The last keeper here before the automation in 1988 was Malcolm Rouse, Mac Rouse, who I got to know. He was also the last keeper at Owl's Head Light down near Rockland. Great guy who has been involved in the preservation of this lighthouse in recent years. The lantern of this lighthouse was restored in 2004 by the Campbell Construction Company out of Massachusetts. Part of that restoration included the return of gargoyles to this lantern. When it was originally built, there were drain spouts in the form of iron gargoyles. They were removed very early in this lighthouse's history, but they were returned in that 2004 restoration. A man from a local company recreated the gargoyles using an original piece from the Maine Lighthouse Museum in Rockland. As I mentioned before, the grounds are now part of a state park. The light is still maintained by the Coast Guard as an active aid to navigation, and the West Quaddy Lightkeepers Association has a visitor center and gift shop in the Keeper's House.
And that voice belongs to Jeremy D'Entremont, president of the American Lighthouse Foundation and our lighthouse guide for the American lighthouses on this boat we're on right now, the Friendship 5, a big, fast catamaran that is about to sweep us into Canada. Thus ends part 1 of a 2-part series featuring the Bar Harbor Whale Watch Grand Slam Tour, an 18-lighthouse tour of Maine's northern coast, right into Canada. We'll pick it up again next Saturday at 9 and Sunday at 8 when Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine returns. Also, last reminder, Bar Harbor Whale Watch has 3 more lighthouse tours coming up. Next weekend, they'll do 16 mid-coast lighthouses. They'll do some local ones in September on a 7-lighthouse morning. And they'll be hosting a 10-lighthouse tour, an all-day trip up the Penobscot River in October. Details at barharborwhales.com. Bar Harbor Whale Watch is a sponsor of Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, as is Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, and EBS. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket.